gotta say, I hated this last episode. I hated it for how good it is, and I really can't imagine a more logical conclusion to the series. We're going to dive into the final episode of Barry, so this is a spoiler warning. We're going to be talking about everything over the course of the series that ties into these final events. So we're not doing a total overview, but there are a lot of spoilers that tie into the course of events in this last episode that I think are really relevant. So I guess you've been warned. And while you're at it, consider subscribing. Check out my other content. I cover video games too, just anything that really piques my interest. I think the best way to talk about this series finale is to discuss the characters and how they were impacted. Disclaimer, we're going to be talking some pretty dark subject matter, as is just the case with the show itself. The show is really goddamn depressing, and so everything we're going to be talking about here is going to be really heavy in some capacity, but it is all for the sake of these story beats here. And I can't think of a better person to start with than Sally. The way her character plays out is really tragic. It's a really heartbreaking story that I think ended as well as it could have for her. Watching her transition to this emotionally tortured woman who has to wear a wig and has to live a totally different life that she never asked for with a child she never wanted. Something that is more of a constant reminder of Barry rather than a real connection between mother and son. Something that stood in really stark contrast with Barry's new reformed Christian dad life, something that he is totally used to doing. He's used to switching his identity up and living as this character that he tells himself that he is. Just an imitation of him trying to become an actor. It's him yet again trying to reinvent himself and become a better person, in his eyes at least. It's like he's telling himself every day that he's not a killer. He's even seen in his car listening to podcasts talking about how to rationalize. Sally's character was always that person that showed the direct effects of Barry's actions, and we see that 8 years later as she has run away with him. Out of everybody here, the one that was most deserving of a more peaceful ending to everything, and I can't think of a better way to tie off her character's arc. I really enjoyed her inclusion in this show, and her decision to pick up and leave, forget Barry, and start a new life was perfect and in line with what anybody else would have done in this scenario, and it just drives home again how bad of a guy Barry is. Now, speaking of people that you didn't want to be bad, but really showed their true colors at the end, NoHo Hank. NoHo Hank was one of my favorite characters this entire series. He really was a scene stealer, and I wish his character kind of ended a little differently. But again, they give you these really likable characters that do these horrible, awful things. It questions whether you should be rooting for them at all. And I think that's what's so great about a lot of these shows is with Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. And these are all really bad people that are just screwing each other over at the end of the day. Nobody really wins. It's just a can you escape with your life? I guess you can call that winning, but nobody's ever satisfied at the end. It's more of a relief. And so to watch as NoHo Hank kind of turns to the dark side over the course of this final season really shows where his priorities lie. He's more concerned about himself. This show deals with a lot of very selfish characters, and he really just gives up Cristobal for the sake of his own life. It isn't until 8 years later when he is shot by Fuchs that he kind of gets some resolve in all of this, but again, it's kind of not what he deserved. He didn't really deserve to die, I don't think. I feel like he kind of deserved to live with his decision a little bit more. So if anybody here got what they deserved, I would say he's one of the ones that didn't. He didn't deserve to die. He deserved to kind of live with that decision. And I guess one could say that death was a bit of an easy way out for him. He chose comfort over the loved ones, and it resulted in the death of his significant other, which he immortalized in the lobby of NoHo Ball. The only person who knew the truth was Fuchs, and so shooting Hank was what Fuchs thought was right. I loved how they were able to give him an unsatisfying end, something that we didn't really expect. I did not expect his character to die. I did not expect him to ride off into the sunset either. It was really up in the air, but I don't think this was the ending I had seen coming for him. Speaking of endings I didn't see coming, Fuchs, that one really surprised me. Now, Fuchs was one of my favorite characters of this show. He is such a piece of crap. Really just is this skeevy little guy who finally gets locked up with Barry and gets his ass kicked. And so 8 years later, he's this totally different reformed guy who's covered in tattoos. He's known as the Raven now. He's not the same person we know, but you know that relationship between him and Barry is still there. And so when he hands Barry's son back over to him, you can see this connection between the two, accepting their coexistence with each other and choosing to take separate paths for the sake of the child. It really drove home the relationship between the two, and the whole scene, the way it played out, was just really heavy. This is one of my favorite scenes of the entire series, just for how loaded it is. I also love the interactions between the Raven and NoHo Hank. Their little bit of a territorial war they had once Fuchs got out of prison was very entertaining to watch, and these are really the events that led up to Hank's death. Had Hank not been so eager to kill Barry, he might still be alive. This shows, again, everybody trying to kill Barry ends up worse off for it. But back to the Raven, this piece of work is played so well by Stephen Root. I love the self-awareness with this character. I wish we got a couple more scenes with him, but he survives, he's alive. To see a spin-off show of the Raven, I'm not against it, because I think that'd be pretty fun, but he's also a total dirtbag, and we already know that. Whereas Barry, over the course of the show, he gets worse and worse, and then we start to question, should we have been rooting for this guy all along? Whereas Fuchs was someone we were never rooting for. We never wanted Fuchs to win, and yet he walks away clean at the end of this show. It is just a total opposite of what I thought was going to happen with him. Him in the first episode, him in the last episode, two totally different characters, and I couldn't have thought of a better way to take his character in a new, fresh, exciting direction. And I never thought he'd be the one to kill NoHo Hank, even though I feel like that was maybe a little obvious, just given the events prior. I honestly didn't think NoHo Hank was going to die anyways. Just really drove home the personal aspect between all these characters. They're all shitty people, and they're all trying to survive, and they're all willing to kill each other if they need to. Not all of them ever actually totally meet, yet you feel like there's this weird connection between all of them. But the one that is tying them all together is Barry. Barry is the reason these people are all interacting with each other, for better or worse. And so it really does just go back to Barry's effect on everybody. And that's why this season, I felt, didn't focus on Barry as much as the victims around him. They really wanted to frame Barry as a total villain in this last season, and I think they did really well. And speaking of characters that were framed as total bad guys, Gene Cousino was a very ironic ending. What a tragic ending to a very tragic character. This guy was always a little self-absorbed. He was always that unassuming victim character, somebody who was so wrapped up in his own head and fame that he couldn't see the real human standing in front of him. And he was always out for himself, so his eagerness to kill Barry in that moment is right in line with what his character would have done. And so being framed as the one who killed the love of his life and Barry is a really ironic ending to the whole show. Had he had just waited a couple more seconds, Barry would have turned himself in, but he couldn't help himself, and even in death, Barry is still living a fake life, immortalized forever as this hero that stood up to Gene Cousino. This article by The Guardian frames it very nicely. Not only did it present a false Hollywood narrative, it framed Barry as a hapless stooge, set up by the criminal mastermind Gene Cousino, then buried with full honors at Arlington. But it also presented itself as the trashy, blood-soaked, gratuitously oversimplified nonsense that many people secretly wish Barry was. And that is reference to the film that is released 10 years after all these events, which we'll touch on a little bit later when we get into Barry himself. It just really frames the entire theme of the show very nicely and puts Cousino's actions into perspective. The show ending in this movie about Barry's life and how he stood up to this tyrant that is Gene Cousino is a total fabrication of the events that actually happened, and really just parallels with a lot of what Hollywood does today in terms of how they adapt real life stories. Now Barry, this is the only way his story could have ended. The only way that people around him could have been freed from his wrath. I really couldn't have imagined a more fitting end for his character. Barry got what he deserved. He didn't get a chance to say anything before he died, and I couldn't think of a better end for his character. It's what he had coming, and so to see him get away again would have just felt like we were treading water rather than something that shakes up the whole trajectory of the show. And I couldn't think of a better way than having Cousino kill him and adding more layers to Cousino himself just based off that one decision. He couldn't run away from what he had done no matter how much he had tried. Even 8 years later, people are still looking for him, and it just shows how much of an impact he had had on the people in his life. Him thinking that he can return and finish this thing once and for all just shows how much of a delusional he was, and not even just because he's playing pretend with his new life, but just the fact that he expects that he can just get away again. The first time he gets shot, he's totally caught off guard. To see Cousino standing behind the gun had to have been extra shocking, and so it's still a little jarring just as a viewer to let Barry dies in such a abrupt way. I shouldn't have been rooting for Barry this whole time anyways. Why am I upset that he died? And so unceremoniously, and brings up all these other questions about where you lie morally in terms of the shows that you watch. Idolizing normalizing serial killers is just the thing these days, and I don't get it. It's super weird, and I think it's just really detrimental to the whole genre, considering that the boundaries are still being pushed, you know, which is evident with Barry itself. These shows often deal with a lot of really shitty, terrible people, and really just serves more as a cautionary tale than anything, I think, but I feel like some people get that mixed up. Barry got what he deserved, and I really didn't accept that it was over when it was over. Upon thinking about the events that happened, I can't imagine a better way for this to have ended, a more deserving way for this to have ended, and as dark and evil as that all sounds, that's the way these characters go. It's just terrible people doing terrible things to each other. That's what's so gripping about all of this, I think. Those are my thoughts on the Barry finale. I'm gonna miss this show. It's one of my favorites, and I'm really excited to see what Bill Hader does next. He's a perfect example of another comedian transitioning into a new genre, a new space, and really stretching his leg, because Jordan Peele did the same thing, and it's working phenomenally for him. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Check out my last couple of videos, and I'll see you next time. Thanks.